I'm going to speak to you today about a paper written recently by Katherine Ritchie. There is an accompanying paper I have written about this presentation, which should be uploaded at the same site. My presentation will follow, but not mimic very completely that paper. As we learned from the sociologist Irving Goffman, there has to be a difference between the living and the read. Professor Ritchie develops an account of cooperation in large formal organizations that does not rely on simply trying to scale up the small group accounts of Bratman, Searle, and Gilbert. Rather, she proposes to build an architecture of roles in this formal organization as a collective action with intentionality at the founding of the formal organization. She describes then that this set or architecture of roles permits the members of the organization to carry on with minimal cooperation towards the collective goal without the burdensome cognitive aspects of a fully scaled up, full-on cooperative activity. There's much merit in her account, as there is in the book on minimal cooperation from which this particular chapter is taken. I do take issue with the second step of her account, which is after collective intentionality allows us to bring this architecture of roles into existence, we can abandon it. To use her metaphor, this is a construction, and we can kick away the construction ladder of collective intentionality in order to carry on with a fully operational formal organization with the role structure in place. In the paper, I reference a large literature on role theory, which comes from sociology and sociology of organizations. In that literature, one sees that roles are not simply the address in space that some individual occupies in the structure of an organization. Rather, role theory depends upon a construct called role identity, which is the relationship between the individual and the role, which is a mental representation tied to the individual self and to their perception of the role. Moreover, it is tied to the perceptions of adjacent individuals in the organization, the supervisor, the subordinate, the peer, in a series of connections wherein the role identity is actively socially constructed in what I would regard as a very dense cognitive process. In the literature, they talk about role making and role taking. In the case, for example, of a new person entering an organization, takes a role or makes a role by having some agency in the early days of their incumbency. There's also role clarification and definition, which involves all of the parties adjacent to that role. There's innovation of the roles, which may come by a particular incumbent as they are associated across the other roles in the organization. And finally, there is a very important literature on this behavior as a written or unwritten set of contracts that exist between the member of the organization and the organization, and how those individuals are able to conform where necessary and to differentiate themselves in their role relative to other peers. To my way of thinking, this implies that there's not as much relief from cognitive burden by Professor Ritchie's model of role construction, because the role construction is not static, it's not finished, and after you kick the ladder away, there is an awful lot of behaviors going on which are changing the nature of individual roles and the relationships between them that may in fact confound the ability of the organization to pursue the goals that they set at the outset. Professor Ritchie brings up the interesting point about fully internalist versus a combination of internalist, externalist representations that allow for cooperation in the firm. I'm going to use one that comes from the philosophy of biology and the philosophy of mind that's been developed in recent years. The picture on this graphic is of a period of development through time that has an internalist set of activities and is supported by external elements, which are called scaffolds. I like the scaffolding not simply because it is a clever counterpoint to ladders. That is, a scaffold is a more elaborate ladder, but the fact that it has been used as a way to show the interactions specifically between internal mental representations and external representations that may include artifacts, may include group constructed projects, such as a constitution, such as an agreement, such as social norms. And so in the paper, I use this to suggest that roles may be part of this external scaffolding, but we have to recognize that the role construction that may happen early in the game can be altered by the interactions between the members of the organization over time. That is, those external scaffolding elements are not fixed. They are actually changing just as events are going on internal to the organization. Well, there may be merit to using the architecture of roles as permanent scaffolding, if you will, in the organization's developmental phases. I suggest in the paper that there is a second mental representation that may have more value in maintaining the intentionality of the group over time for the completion of tasks. That construct also comes from the sociology of organizations, is organizational identity. We've talked about the self We've talked about role identity, but now we are going to consider what is the identity of the organization. In the literature, the question is always asked, who are we? And this has two senses to it. One is the we-ness, that is the constituent nature of the organization. But there's always an aboutness. And this aboutness is to deal with mandate, with collective intentionality, collective beliefs, and the things like that which are part and parcel of Brian Epstein's 2017 depiction of what are human groups. Now, the organizational identity is always conceived as being central and, if you will, salient to the organization's self-representation. It would also be distinctive. So one can infer from our understanding of our organization's identity not only who we are, but who are we not. And this identity should be enduring over time. Now, the paper goes on to describe whether enduring means fixed or whether enduring may allow for changes over time that are purposeful results of collective intentionality by the group. For now, let's just consider that the important thing here is just as the individuals in the formal group have an identification process with their roles, they also have an identification process with the organizational identity. Do I fit here? Is this the right organization for me? Are my goals consistent with the group goals? To the extent that these things exist and that organizational identity is indeed salient for all or most of the group membership, then the organizational identity conditions group intentionality to the point that I would argue that it is, in a true sense, we intentionality. The last of the concepts that I introduce from organizational sociology has to do with the network structure of the individuals and their roles in a formal organization. I'm sure you've seen these depictions, network connections between the individuals in an organization. The picture on this screen is laughably simple, but it introduces something which is very important in these depictions, and that is there may exist clusters of individuals working in this formal organization that are not directly tied together by individual action or by having role responsibilities or role identities that naturally bring this to happen. These gaps in the organizational network structure are called structural holes by Ron Burt. It's kind of a clumsy name, but it satisfies the need to describe unlinked groups that may exist in an organization. Some of the groups may have very highly redundant, close ties among them. The kind of work teams, how you exist inside your department in an otherwise diffused network of colleagues at your university. This structural whole can be bridged by the two individuals that you see there connected by the dotted line, who take on, as part of their role identities, the task of brokering information, beliefs, knowledge, and other mental representations between their respective groups. In the paper, I make an argument that some of this is handled by role members that have almost strictly administrative identities. That these people may be responsible as a node in the middle of this structural whole for connecting to the two members that are otherwise not spanning the structural whole. On the other hand, this may not be an administrative individual. It may in fact be two peers that are reaching across their respectively separated roles in order to make the connection. In the paper, I also bring up the 6th chapter of Tumala's 2013 book, where he allows for external authority, that is, the leader who exists outside the group cluster, to require of the groups to behave as groups, to act collectively. And I think that this is an important link between an internalist account of what's going on inside the firm and an externalist account with scaffolding. That is to say, it may be the responsibility of that leader, authority figure, whatever you wish to call them, who sits between these two clusters, to provide collective reason. And so that may be supported, and I believe should be supported, by that person's understanding of the collective identity and how the members of the organization should identify with it. As a quick summation then, I think that by bringing all of these elements together, we have an alternative to Ritchie's static role substrate for minimal cooperation. That is, if in fact there are sub-networks or groups operating in the firm with full-on cooperation among them, basically following the small group accounts of collective intentionality, we can then, with some kind of scaffolding, span the structural holes between those groups by relating to group identity or organizational identity, using external authority which is consistent with the collective identity, and using that as a specific role identity for some individuals who are responsible for maintaining, if you will, an enduring relationship between the organizational members, their collective understanding of the organizational identity and the group goals. And we're not going to knock this scaffold away. It is going to exist all across the developmental stages of the organization, but we will allow it to evolve or adapt along with the internalist processes in a dialectic between the internal and the external representations that matter. Thank you. I hope to see you during the discussion period set aside in the SO 2021 schedule. If you can't participate in that and wish to engage with me, send me an email and we'll begin our conversation. Thank you.